Am I responding in a way that gives them, some comfort and knows that, maybe I'm not going to be so happy with the choice that they've made, but I'm not totally shutting them down. I'm continuing the conversation. I'm there to support them because, we want to leave that door open for them to see us as someone they could come to and ask questions of and get support even when they've made giant mistakes.
Today I am speaking with Julianne Reilly, and she is in Washington, D.C., United States area. And she works with parents and teachers alike. She's a positive discipline educator trainer, and she also is a counselor therapist. So I will let Julianne talk about her journey. And most importantly, she's also a mama, just like me. So welcome to Now What Podcast with Yogi Patel. And today we're going to just talk a lot about anxiety and other topics as it comes up. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a clinical social worker by training. I was a teacher before that, and I became really passionate about supporting kids, from early on when I was babysitting, and I was a young teenager, and I knew I wanted to work with kids and adolescents. So I went into teaching, and then through that, I really wanted to do more support around mental health and the social emotional world of kids. And so I became a clinical social worker. I've worked primarily in schools for many years, and I now am also working privately, seeing a lot of parents and caregivers and just supporting them through all of the normal challenges that come along with caring for children, and also some of the more challenging moments that involve bigger things like more severe anxiety and other challenges that can come into play along the way. And yes, I'm a mom to 2 kids myself. And so I've had lots of opportunity and will continue to have lots of opportunity to practice all of this imperfectly as a parent myself. And so I use a lot of that as opportunities to really reflect on what I'm supporting other parents through and how challenging it can be for myself, even with all of that knowledge.
What a great point that even though we learn a lot, or we might be in the profession of supporting others, we're not challenge-free. So no one is alone in their journey of things that happen in raising children or working with children. Mm-hmm. However, we know it's the most important position any person could hold is to have the pleasure of being around younger friends. And thank you for being here today. And we're going to get right into a lot of conversation today, particularly you and I both have common interest of Positive Discipline by Dr. Jane Nelson and Lynn Lott, their first book that took off. And now we have trainings for teachers, parents, leaders, and many more. We both work with a variety of different theorists. We put a lot of other work into our beliefs and systems that we use. In your case, you just added something called space. And I'm not really familiar too well besides the conversations we've had. Can you tell us a little bit more about what SPACE is?
SPACE is a evidence-based model that is about treating childhood anxiety, but primarily by working with the parents and caregivers and other adults, who are in that child or adolescent's life. As I said, it's been a well-researched model. It was developed by a man named Elie Leibowitz out of the Yale Child Study Center. It really is based on this idea of nonviolent resistance and Haim Omar's work around nonviolent resistance. And I can dig in a little more about what that means. It's really been a fascinating journey for me to learn about because so often I work with a lot of kids and teens who struggle with anxiety, both what we call like the little a anxiety, which is just normal anxiety we all have to manage throughout our lives. And then we like to say like the big A anxiety when it becomes kind of this thing that is impacting your life so significantly that it's interfering with daily life. But that's something that I think shows up in my work most often. If people are saying like, what do you see kind of in your office, both at school and outside of school most commonly? And it's some range of relation to anxiety. And so often parents struggle or caregivers struggle to get those kids in the door to more support, to therapy, to more intensive therapy if needed, even if they can, unless parents or caregivers or whoever are the adults who are most involved in that child's life are getting support around how to interact with their child related to the anxiety, some of that treatment is not always as successful as it could be. What space really does is support parents in understanding the anxiety in the first place and like what is actually happening under the surface for their child or adolescent. And then how do they actually engage with it? How do they respond to their child in those moments of anxiety? And then how are some of their behavior maybe exacerbating the problem and or really supporting their child and helping them learn to tolerate it? One thing that we talk about a lot is, a bunch of my colleagues and I talk about this, is that I think our field of mental health has sometimes done a disservice in making people think that like getting therapy is about making anxiety go away, right? Is like kind of smoothing everything over, having people feel better, when really it's really the work that we're doing in space and that I hope we're continuing to do in any other forum is helping people learn to tolerate anxiety, right? And we all are going to experience it. Every single one of us are going to experience some level of anxiety. It's actually really beneficial in some moments, right? So like before you take a test, it's good to feel some anxiety. Maybe it isn't pleasant, right? But it's actually going to help you really know like, okay, I've got to study for that test. It's going to get you motivated to make sure you're prepared, to make sure you're really focused on what needs to happen before a big soccer game, before you go on stage. A certain level of anxiety is really important. If you get in a fight with a friend and you need to repair it with them, right? Like, of course, you're going to feel a little bit of anxiety around that. And sometimes it can become so big, right, that it, like I said, it can interfere with things. And sometimes as parents and caregivers in loving adults in our children's and adolescents' lives, we start to jump in and kind of try to protect our kids from that feeling, right? We might participate in helping them avoid something or try to kind of smooth it over or do it for them, or on the other hand, dismiss some of those feelings that they're having. And so those are some of the times where we are trying to help them, right? We're coming from this wonderful place of loving and caring, and it can often make the problem worse. So an example of that might be, I use the example of your child is afraid at night in the house, right? They're afraid to go to bed at night because maybe they're afraid someone's going to break in the house. As a loving parent, you might say like, don't worry, the police station's right down the street. I locked all the doors. We've got a dog who will bark. And all of those sound totally reasonable to kind of reassure the child that they're going to be okay. When actually what it might be doing is kind of reinforcing the idea that there is something to be afraid of, right? So like instead the child's like, oh my gosh, we live near a police station. My parents checked the locks because maybe they're afraid someone really might break in. We got this big dog, right? And so it's actually reinforcing some of that when in reality, it's not really about like kind of the content. It's about helping the child learn that, yes, sometimes maybe when I'm laying in bed at night, I feel that thought that pops in my head, like maybe I'm a little scared too. And I can tolerate that feeling, right? That that I can handle the feeling that's there. So a lot of the work that we do with parents in spaces around understanding what happens when anxiety shows up, how can it present? And we could talk more about that. And then how do we actually engage with it in a way that's going to be helpful for our kids to tolerate it more? And in the end, right, when we know that we can tolerate something, it doesn't feel so big, right? If we know we can handle something, it doesn't feel so big and overwhelming. And that's really the goal. And so we talk with parents about how do they respond supportively, and we teach them about what that means within the context of space. And then we also talk with parents about how do they look at the accommodations they're making for the anxiety that might be actually having a negative effect. And then how do we start to kind of pull back and start reducing those accommodations? And so those are different ways of how we start to engage, but it's a process that we go through with parents.
Is this something that is done one-on-one? Parents reach out to folks in space. How do they find individuals that are in their area?
You can. There's a lot of therapists all over the country and the world who are using space. There is a website for space treatment. I think it's spacetreatment.net. And if you go there, they do have a list of providers who've been trained and also providers who've gone through additional training and who are certified in space. It's really, if you do it kind of in full, it's a 12 or more weekly sessions with a therapist to help coach you through it. That being said, there's a lot of providers out there now who are offering kind of multi-session work groups or workshops to help parents or caregivers understand space a little bit more and get a little bit of individualized support around it, but really be able, then the parents can kind of work through it on their own. Ellie Lieberitz wrote a wonderful book that is based in space. It's sort of giving parents a guide so they understand more of it. And so for some parents, that might be enough, right? To be able to participate in a group or read the book and get the ideas and the philosophy and start kind of employing it on their own. For other parents who have kind of a more complex situation, maybe that their child is avoiding school and it's become pretty significant, or maybe there's some aggression at play or other kind of more significant things that are going on, they might want to have some more individualized support, because sometimes going through this process can be really tricky. And we also bring our own stuff to the table, right? We all are bringing our own, maybe things that have happened for us in childhood, how our parents were with us. Maybe we have our own anxiety we're trying to manage. And so we also need to be able to navigate that and be able to maybe get support from someone around what is coming up for us as we go through the process and what might get in our way in order to be successful. So it really just depends from person to person on what's going to be helpful.
Perfect examples. And one that comes to mind for me is preparing children for starting school, right? So we get all excited about first day of school and you're going to go and you're going to have fun. And then, this anxiety creeps in. For some children, that anxiety lasts for a very, very long time. And for some, it's they're anxious for the first week or so, and then they tend to adapt. What are some of the things, in your opinion, now, haven't talked about it, that we can do to support children in transitioning to a different environment from home?
I sort of talked a little bit about that idea of support. And what that means in space is offering both acceptance and validation of whatever the child, the adolescent, and honestly, you can do this with an adult, right, is feeling in the moment. So it might look like, oh my gosh, I see how nervous you are to start school. Just naming it, right? Just having that person in front of you feel seen and heard, and combining that with a confidence in them that they can handle it. And by handle it, I don't necessarily mean handle going to school. I mean handling the feeling that is coming up. So I see you're feeling really, really nervous about going to school next week. And I've seen you do really hard things. I know you're going to be able to handle that feeling. And that's what we call a supportive statement. And so it's combining, again, that acceptance and validation of what they're feeling and the confidence that they can handle that feeling and that you believe they're capable of it. That can be kind of hard for us sometimes as parents, because we might, if they're going off to kindergarten, maybe it's our first child, or maybe it's you have multiple children and it's your last child and you're feeling feelings about it too. It can be really hard to kind of give off that sense of confidence and really be able to own that and project that onto your child. Those are the two components that we look for in how we respond to it. So often we don't want our children to feel that unpleasant feeling, right? Of feeling nervous or feeling worried. And so we kind of try to explain it away, like, you're going to be fine. You know the teacher, you've met some of the kids that are going to be there. Remember, your big sister's going to be there. They're going to walk to school. And we're providing all sorts of reassurance around it, which, in a certain amount is not the worst thing in the world. And it's okay. It's actually really healthy and normal for them to be really nervous about it. It's a totally new experience. And so sometimes we have to kind of step back from trying to make it okay, right? And trying to help them avoid the feeling and just kind of accept that it's okay and it's normal to feel that way when you're about to start a new thing. So you might offer that supportive statement, and then maybe you might talk about when you had an experience where you felt really nervous starting something new. If you remember what it was like for you when you were starting kindergarten, or when you started at a new school, or you started a new job, helping them feel, that they're not alone in that, and that it's okay to feel that way. And then maybe there's strategies that you've used to help when you're feeling that way, not necessarily to get rid of the feeling, right? That's the reframe, right? But just take care of yourself while you're feeling it too. So that's kind of the first step, and like you said, some kids, they're going to feel it really intensely in that anticipation. And then once they get started, it's going to kind of dissipate. For other kids, it might last a little bit longer. And so, depending on that level, right? Sometimes you just kind of keep putting that support in place, holding on. And it's also okay to draw in support from the school, right? And have them be helpful and helping you work through, like, what does that transition plan look like so that you're slowly building the confidence in the child that they can handle more and more.
I love this point, especially the transition period in schools when they're very littles. And we invite them to come in just for a visit and then just maybe come for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, gradually go into school rather than, we're working parents often and we just have to. And I'm not saying that everyone can afford this, but sometimes transitioning them slowly to their new environment could really be very helpful.
Yeah.
You spoke about accommodations. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
In the American school system, we have accommodations that we use in the school system when a child might be having a learning challenge or be diagnosed with some kind of learning disability. And those are wonderful accommodations that help kind of level the playing field, right? If a child has dyslexia, right, where they're struggling with reading in a certain way, we make certain accommodations in order for them to access the curriculum more effectively. We have over time used the same kind of model when it comes to anxiety. So when a child is experiencing significant levels of anxiety or diagnosed with anxiety, we put accommodations in place that actually allow them to avoid feeling some of the anxiety. And sometimes those can kind of backfire on us, right? It's sort of the idea that we accommodate for the anxiety rather than helping them scaffold to learn to tolerate it. We do that as parents outside of the home too, right? So thinking about my example with the child having trouble falling asleep. And so an accommodation is that ongoing reassurance, right? That like excessive reassurance about the worry. Another one might be like the child is really anxious about going to a party, right? By themselves. They don't want to go to this birthday party by themselves. They want to go to the party, but they want you to be with them. And so you go to the party, you stay right with them the whole time. And they're okay at the party. But then we've kind of reinforced that idea that they need you to be there with them the whole time. So one of the things that we do in space is look at all of the accommodations we might be making as a parent or a caregiver. We actually map them out on a whole map of like from morning to night, in the middle of the night, right? What are all the things we might do to accommodate the anxiety specifically? And then pick one specific place that we could start by just like slowly peeling that back. So it's not about changing it all at once or pulling the rug out from under the kid or yourself, because that would be too much. It's about picking one small space that happens often enough that it might be good practice and make a difference that matters to you as the adult. Like it's something you actually want to change, because sometimes we do things for our kids and we don't want to change that spot. And then it also has to be something that you are fully in control of. So one of the most important parts of what we do in space is it is not about making the child or the adolescent do anything different. It's about the adult changing their behavior in order to allow the child to tolerate a little bit more. So we have to find a spot like that. And so then we start to peel that back just a little bit, start to reduce the accommodations. And it can be the tiniest little slice, right? It doesn't have to be something huge. And that is one way that then it slowly allows the child to learn to tolerate that feeling a little bit more. If we always kind of tolerate it for them by participating in those accommodations and kind of removing the possibility that they're going to feel that unpleasant feeling at all, they really don't have the opportunity to practice that skill. And, for example, if a parent's always reading and editing every single one of the kids' assignments, right? Because the child is anxious, right? They can't turn it in unless the parent reads it and edits it. Then when the child gets, 100% on it, that's great, right? But the child may not actually feel the feeling that of like success and achievement that we want them to feel, because part of them is going to know, oh, that's maybe because mom helped me with that last night, right? And so it's not that we can't give support, right? Some of our kids need that little scaffolding of support, but it's thinking about what is our purpose in doing this? Is it to avoid the feeling of anxiety? And if so, how can we start just like slowly inching towards a little bit more tolerating? And not all accommodations are unhelpful, right? So we also like to talk about the example of seeing a parent sitting right outside the kindergarten classroom, right? If we just saw a parent sitting outside the kindergarten classroom all day, what would be your initial thought? Maybe
this parent is really worried about their child feeling anything.
Yeah, right. So maybe and we might make some judgments, right? We might say like, oh my gosh, they're accommodating, like they really need to let go a little bit. But what we really need to know actually before we make that judgment, although we all are human, right? We make judgments in our minds, is what was happening before and what's going to happen after. So if that child, they weren't able to get that child to school for the last week, and part of the plan was that the parent was going to sit outside the classroom for a week, and then the next week the parent was going to sit in the parking lot, and then the next week the parent was going to be down the street, and we're slowly reducing the accommodations, then that's actually a really helpful accommodation, right? Because we've got the kid in the door and we have a plan for reducing the accommodations. If that parent is just their plan is just to sit there all day, every day for the whole year, that's probably not going to be a helpful accommodation. So the idea is not just to, pull the rug out from underneath the child. It's really about helping slowly in different ways. And it's going to look very different for every kid and family, but slowly begin to tolerate a little bit more and more over time and demonstrate that we know they can handle tolerating those feelings too.
Julianne, I actually have a question about this parent. So many school leaders and teachers, we have parents who are also very, very anxious themselves about separation anxiety. When they are, like you said, the example of a parent who's having a very difficult time leaving the school and saying farewell, and that emotions kind of continue for a longer period of time. How can we support the parents who are overly anxious? And sometimes the children aren't as anxious as the parents are.
I think just starting with some education, right, of understanding, like one of the first things we start with when we're working with parents in space, whether it's me working individually with a set of parents or caregivers or in the group, is we talk about how anxiety is really an interpersonal interaction. And so childhood anxiety is really the anxiety the child is feeling, that chemical experience that's happening for them, less the response from the parent or caregiver. And so thinking about your toddler when they fall at the playground and how we respond to them often does impact how they manage it, right? So if we kind of dismiss it, maybe they're like wondering if what they're feeling is okay or real. If we go in and we give them we're so worried about them, they might cry more, right? But if we kind of find that balance of oh, that looked like that hurt. Okay, what do you need? Well, you can handle this. We get up and we get moving, right? Often kids can kind of move through that experience. And so using that kind of as a model of thinking, helping parents understand that the way that we respond to our kids' anxiety really does have an impact on how it presents. And one of the things I spend a lot of time is trying to take the judgment away, because 100% of parents who have an anxious kiddo are going to accommodate. We're going to. And I have an anxious kiddo and I've trained in this stuff and I still do all of this, right? So I just taking the shame out of it, right? This is not about telling parents that they have caused this. Most kids who are anxious were born with a certain temperament. Not all of them, but a lot of time they're born with a sensitive temperament and they're kind of prone to that anxiety. And so when you have a kid like that, you start to respond to them in a certain way because you love them and you care about them. You don't want to see them struggling. And maybe you just need to get through the day, right? You need to get them to school. So you start accommodating to get them to school. And sometimes it's not until it's become so much accommodating that it's impacting your family life that you realize, oh, I need some help around this, and kind of try to figure it out. And so back to your, I know that was a roundabout way, back to your question, is helping parents kind of understand that and understand that you all know what you're doing, right, in the school, and finding a plan that feels like it works for them, right? And so supporting them and validating that they know it's really hard for them. And you can use kind of the same exact skills that we're using with our kids here, right? It is so hard to watch your little kid walk in the school doors and not be with them all day long, right? That. Oh, that is so hard. And I know you can handle that, right? I know you can handle this feeling. And we're so excited to, send them home at the end of the day and share that with you. And so that's how I would encourage schools to support parents instead of just kind of judging that feeling there. And then if you're a parent yourself and you're struggling with that, just be kind to yourself, right? You can feel that and try not to participate in kind of getting in the way of your child's experience in knowing that they can handle it. I tend to be an anxious person, right? And one thing I had to do a lot of work around is being able to recognize the feelings that come up for me and figure out how do I manage them without putting them on to my child. I'm not always perfect at it, right? It's going to happen sometimes. No, none of us are. And so it's just a constant work in progress. And, I talk to my kids about it, right? I'm open about the things that I'm working on, and they can help me with those things too, we kind of talk openly about that. And so just, the first step is recognizing it, right? And then validating those feelings yourself and then figuring out, okay, what are you going to do? And often when parents are starting to reduce accommodations, we help them work through a whole plan. What's going to happen? How is it going to happen? When? Who's going to do what? What are the worst case scenarios for what might happen when you start to reduce this? What are you going to do instead? Because you might really struggle with this. And so what are you going to put in place for yourself that's going to help you be able to manage making these changes and shifts in your own behavior too?
Talking about, you said the awareness. So how do we realize that we are anxious or there is an anxiety feeling? Because to me, I think sometimes we're not even conscious that we're anxious, but we might be so anxious in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a tough one. I think it can be different for everyone, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people we talk about when we start to educate parents on anxiety is that they're kind of 4 components of anxiety and how it shows up, right? We have the cognitive component, right? Where we have these ruminating thoughts, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if when my kid walks in school, something happens to them and I'm not there? What if we, get in a car accident on the way home? And we're kind of having those worry thoughts that pop in our head all the time. That would be one sign that those thoughts, those what if thoughts, right, are bugging you a lot. We all have them, right? Everyone has thoughts like that pop up from time to time, but it's kind of when it's impacting you so much that it's kind of interfering with either your mood or your daily life or that kind of thing. We also talk about our physical experience, right? So some people experience panic attacks, right? Or mild little moments of panic where their chest feels really tight or their heart is beating really fast or they feel like they've got a stomach or they have a kind of stomach ache or they're feeling really tense, kind of like they're, ready for that fight, flight or freeze. And that is that experience, that physical experience, right, of that. So it depends how it presents for you and how it shows up. And it's important to kind of recognize that and start to tune into yourself. If you're struggling with kind of your life moving or their daily life moving in the way that I think you might want it to be, you might just stop and try to tune into yourself. Sometimes anxious people, and I'm using myself included, are not the best at pausing and really recognizing what's actually happening because we're kind of that adrenaline is running through our bodies and we're kind of on the go trying to kind of make everything okay. And so just stopping and being able to tune into that. And then if you notice that there's something like that, it is really kind of getting in your way of being able to function in the way that you want to or show up for your kids in the way that you really would like to, then getting some support around that is really important. And not because there's anything wrong with you, right? But because having support is in kind of being able to work through what might be going on and strategies for how to manage that can be really, really helpful. We talk in space, there's a whole component we talk about supporters. As part of our plan, as we begin reducing accommodations, we try to talk about who are the people in our lives who can be part of this plan, who will be supportive. They could be people at school. They could be, counselors, teachers, administrators who might be helpful as part of the plan. They could be neighbors, family members, friends, and just finding ways to really bring the community into the process in any way that feels comfortable for that family can be really powerful and helpful. So I would say the same thing, right? If you start to notice something, you're like, I'm not quite sure, something is really impacting me here. Reach out for some support from someone and start there. Anxiety can present in interesting ways, right? So sometimes we think it's just us feeling worried all the time, but some people feel it as anger, right? We're feeling really aggressive and angry a lot. And what's underneath of that is that anxiety or sadness, right? Or distractibility. Often ADHD and anxiety kind of can be hard to tease out because sometimes a child is really struggling to pay attention. They're having trouble maintaining their focus on kind of whatever it is they need to maintain their focus on in that moment. And so then they start to feel anxiety about that. So what we see is the anxiety, but maybe underneath there's actually that distractibility issue, or vice versa. A kid is quite anxious, so they can look quite distracted, right? But really what's underneath that is that they're constantly having these worried thoughts that are popping in their head. And so it's really important to not just assume that what you see on the surface is actually, what's going on, really digging underneath what we see on the surface. And we talk about that in positive discipline, right? Like what we see on that tip of the iceberg is not the whole story. And that there's a lot more that could be going on. And so really taking a step back to dig into that so we can actually address like the root of the issue is really important.
In schools, when children are anxious and we have them, let's say they come to your office and they meet with you and you come up with a plan, how does that plan get integrated into the school system? If in your case, let's say you're a counselor, that would be great. But if the student is at a different school?
Well, every school is different, right? So every school system or independent school has their own structures in place. But I think it's really valuable whatever system you're in, to have a team effort, right? So if, for example, that child comes to my office and I'm coming up with a plan with them, I want all the people in the building who interact with that child to know what the plan is, if they need to, right? They don't need to know the child's personal information, right, and all the details. But we want people to know so that we can respond consistently across the board, supportively across the board, because that's going to give the child the most opportunity for success around it. I always joke that like sometimes people think when kids come into my office, they're melting down, and then 10 minutes later, they're okay and they leave the office and they're like, what did you do? You did some magical thing. I'm like, I didn't. Literally all I did was just sit and hold space for them to feel whatever they're feeling, right? Sometimes I give them some tools and I'm turning around and getting other work done for a few minutes because they just need that time to decompress. And then they need some validation. And one thing that I think is really helpful for adults to understand, and this actually applies to adults too, is the cycle of validation and the cycle of invalidation. So when we invalidate someone's feelings, then what that person starts to feel, right? A child, for example, has different reactions, right? So say the child is really afraid of the dog that's on the street. And you're like, no, there's nothing to be afraid of. Everything's fine, right? Which is the first response that many adults, and myself included, might provide in that moment, right? To try to help the kid feel a little bit better. What can end up happening, right, because that kind of invalidates the child's feeling, is that the child might be like, am I crazy? I'm feeling this really intense feeling, but my mom doesn't think I should be feeling this. So is there something wrong with me that I'm feeling this, right? And so that might be the first possible response. Some kids might kind of just shut down, be like, okay, I guess I can't say anything more about this feeling, and withdrawal. Some kids might get louder and louder, right? Because they want to make someone understand the feeling that they're feeling. And so we have plenty of cases where we see that, where kids' behavior becomes more and more intense because they have some need, right? They're not even fully conscious of it, but they need the adults around them to understand how painful whatever it is that they're feeling is, and people aren't getting it. And so what can end up happening, right, is having these negative impacts where we're trying, often that invalidation is out of love, right? It's not because we're about trying to purposefully invalidate, right? Sometimes we are, but most of the time it's out of love, right? Is that it actually has, an effect. The impact is not what we're hoping. And so validating, on the other hand, right, when we kind of push into it, like, wow, you're really scared of that dog over there. Like, yeah, like I can see that this is really making you nervous, right? It actually, even though it feels like it wouldn't, right, it actually can calm things down, because the child can be like, oh, they get it. Like they see what I'm feeling. They understand. And we probably had that experience as adults, right? When someone just sees and gets it, right? And gets the feeling that you're having, which can be really hard to do, to understand what someone else is actually feeling. But when you feel seen and heard, you're often much calmer, right? It helps bring things down. And so cycle of validation can be really powerful, right? Because it can help a child feel seen, and you're kind of pushing in rather than pulling out. I don't know if you can picture one of those finger traps that, like, if you put your fingers in the two sides and you pull, you get stuck. And so we use that as an example for parents that I work with of like, when you're pulling against the feeling, like trying to make it go away, you actually get stuck. But if you push in, right, it's kind of a paradox, but if you push into it, it can loosen things up and help kind of move things forward in that way.
Similar to muscle tension. Sometimes it needs a little bit of input and application for it to release. What you shared is so true, even in adults. When we're speaking to someone, when there's a new situation, we tend to be on high alert and the brain is just sort of feeling all sorts of things. But as soon as you make one or two friends, or when someone validates your feelings or even kind of relates to what you're speaking of, really right away you begin to calm and feel that acceptance. And that acceptance seems to be a big piece, is what I'm hearing. Often that what if thinking is what we expect out of life. And then the reality might be a little bit different. And that gap, that stress is where all those feelings emerge. And for young children, it's all subconscious. So it could pop up at any moment. And as busy teachers and parents, we're doing the best that we can. So I appreciate that not having the shame part of it. We're all experiencing all of this, but how do we sort of just tweak everything just a little bit? And so it's not going cold turkey and it's not starting a new method. It's just adjusting and being aware of where we are, our input, and how this kind of relates to our students. In summary is what I understand it to be. So we're talking about supporting children and adults, especially in terms of anxiety. What would help us in creating this shift long term? So we begin to work with the children, and how does that get them kickstarted for their future?
Yeah, well, this is kind of a long-term approach, right? And so that accommodating is the short-term approach, right? So in the moment, you're kind of accommodating for the anxiety by helping the child avoid, reassuring them, doing something for them instead of having them do that themselves. And that does deal with the anxiety in the short term, right? And decreases it. It works in the short term. What that ends up doing is kind of the child then doesn't get the experience to learn. They can tolerate the feeling. They're also getting sent the message, oh, maybe there is something to be fearful of, right? And I should continue to kind of avoid this. And it can actually increase the anxiety on the whole. And so by using this approach, right, and thinking about how do you start to kind of step back while we're still responding supportively, you are giving your child an opportunity to grow that muscle, that figurative muscle of learning to tolerate unpleasant emotions. And, I wish that we could kind of pave the way for our kids and so that they don't ever have to feel the things that we've experienced or felt. But that's just not what life is like, right? And that's actually, I say I wish, but I don't know that I actually would wish that, because some of our growth, right, our most powerful growth as humans is through adversity and challenging moments. And we as parents and caregivers, I think, want to impart all of our experiences on our kids so they don't have to kind of do it over again the way we did. But that's how we learn, right? That's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we understand ourselves. And so by going through this process, you are allowing your children to learn that they are capable, right? Not only of doing hard things, but of tolerating unpleasant emotions. And I always make the point that I use the word pleasant and unpleasant. And I do this when I'm working with kids, of not using the word good or bad when I talk about feelings, because there are no bad feelings. There are feelings that don't feel great, right? They're unpleasant to experience, but they're important, right? Like we talked at the beginning, why anxiety can be really important, right? It can keep us safe, right? In moments of danger. Sadness helps us know when something really matters to us, right? And anger, same thing. When we see an injustice and we feel angry, it's helping us know where do we want to focus our energy and attention. And so those unpleasant feelings, those emotional experiences, while they're unpleasant, they're important. We try to focus on that idea of unpleasant and pleasant versus good or bad, because we want kids to learn that the range of emotions is part of life and that they can tolerate them. And so that long-term approach, you are step by step helping them to build that muscle of tolerating unpleasant feelings, knowing they can handle it, knowing they're capable of managing challenging moments and difficult things. And that, right, as you move through life, is going to be one of the most important skills that they have, right? Because whatever they face, they're going to know, even if it's hard, that they can manage it. And so that's kind of, I think, sometimes what can be helpful for parents to think long term. It's really hard in this moment to step away and watch my kid crying or struggling in this moment. But what I'm really doing is helping them build this skill for the future. There's a quote, and I don't want to mess it up. There's a psychologist in our DC area named Bill Stixrud, and he has a quote that he says, children don't feel loved by getting what they want, right? They feel loved by getting what they need. And so, and we talk, of course, about that in positive discipline, that by loving our children, it doesn't mean that they're always going to feel happy and pleasant, right? All the time. It's that we're supporting them and knowing that they can tolerate all of these things and handle things and feel capable and confident in themselves too.
Similar to how adults, we go out to exercise. I'm a metaphor person. So if you go out and you exercise first day, you're going to ache. And not giving up right there is just, that's how we develop the muscle. It's unpleasant.
Exactly.
On working out, you want to become healthy. And I think what you just shared is the path to our children's mental health and anxiety will never go away completely because it'll turn up. However, having that muscle memory of having to deal with a situation will help our children as they become young adults and older. So
exactly.
Homework and academic stresses often cause tensions in families. I know for my families, there were times when my children didn't understand something. It really, got that reaction. And what approaches do you recommend for parents to support their children academically while also managing that stress level for ourselves, our children, and creating that healthy space so the homework doesn't become this negative, anxious space?
That's a really great question because I see that pop up for lots of families. And I think it's really hard, right? Because the parent role in that process can be one that really brings up some power struggles, right? Kids may be like, you don't know how to help me because they taught it this way and you're trying to teach me that way, or you're trying to make me do it the way you want to do it, right? There can be so many things that pop up when also the child maybe really does need some support and some help. Starting from a place of curiosity around like what would be most helpful, even asking your child that, like, I see you're struggling with this. Like, I see you're frustrated that you can't figure this out. What would be most helpful to you right now? What do you think? Let's brainstorm some ideas rather than just kind of jumping in ready to kind of fix it or rescue them. And it kind of goes along with a lot of what we were talking about in the space work of like noticing their experience in that moment and that they can handle challenging things, right? Maybe they don't actually know how to do that math problem, but they can tolerate the discomfort of trying to figure it out, maybe not knowing and taking it in the next day to ask the teacher. And so I think there is also a difference between like, is this a one moment thing that you're trying to jump in around, or is it becoming a consistent issue in your household? And so I, as a school counselor, I've worked with families to say, you know what? I want you to step out. I've said this to parents, like you step out of the process of helping your child because it is impacting your relationship. Right? Like you're getting in power struggles every night. So you let them do what they're going to do and we will handle it at school. Like if they don't finish their homework, they come to school, we'll come up with a plan at school together. Or for parents who are, can manage it or can ask for help from the school, bringing in a third party to help with that support, right? Like asking the school, can they stay a little bit later? Some schools, not all schools, but some schools may have like a study hall time or a time where they can stay and ask questions from a teacher. Some families may be able to have the means to have a tutor or someone who can offer support. So finding other people or even another family member, right? I had a family who the mom could not help with math, but they found that the child really responded well to their grandfather helping. So finding other people who are in your community and whatever that looks like, who can step into that process and offer support can just kind of take the heat out of it, right? Because of course, if a kid's feeling that unpleasant experience of being frustrated, it's so much easier for them to get mad at you, right? As their loving parent, because they know you're going to love them no matter what, right? Like, can project it onto you than feeling that discomfort that they don't know how to do something or they're struggling with something. And so just, I think stepping out of the power struggle is the most important. My husband and I have a saying, we say to ourselves, drop the rope. So if we see one of us starting to get into a power struggle with one of our kids, we will remind the other one, most of the time lovingly, although sometimes it's not so loving. Let's just say, drop the rope. Like, this isn't going anywhere helpful. And so stepping out of that, depending on your child's age, shooting an email to the teacher and just saying, hey, we're getting in these power struggles at night. I'm not quite sure what to do. Can we have a conversation? Because I don't want to just abandon them, but I also just can't keep, getting into this with them. But I would also say at a time that's not heated, right? That's not in the midst of that frustration, maybe sitting down and talking with your child around like problem solving, right? So, hey, I've noticed that like every day we're getting in a bit of a fight about homework and I don't want to do that with you. I love you too much to keep going through that with you. Like, can we brainstorm some ideas for what we could do instead? What would be helpful, and think through that process. If you have family meetings, adding it to that agenda and talking about it and getting buy-in from the child around what would be most helpful. I think as adults, we often sometimes implement plans for our kids without much of their input, right? And assuming we think we know what would work because it's what works for us or what we think, and really bringing them into the conversation and getting their buy-in and understanding, helping them like think about what really will work for them is really helpful and important, and contributes to kind of building those long-term skills we want them to have.
Parents listening to you might think of this idea for the first time. So what types of questions would they be willing, could they ask, let's say, their teenager who's used to having this other type of method where the homework has become chaotic? Now you're shifting to a new way of doing it. How could parents engage with their teens in this conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on what exactly has been going on, but I think that just maybe going and getting ice cream with them, or like doing something and sitting down and just saying, hey, like we've been fighting a lot about homework. Like, I'm trying to help you. It seems like you need help, but then when I try to help, we get in a big battle. It just doesn't feel great, right? And I love you too much to keep fighting with you about this. So I'm not really sure what to do, and just kind of start with curiosity. Like, do you have any ideas? What's helpful? Like, some helpful questions be like, what is it about what I do that's helpful? What do I do that's not helpful? Let's make a plan for tomorrow. Like, when you say you need help, how should I engage with you? And okay, if you start to do this, this, and this, maybe some of the things that can lead to that power struggle or that, back and forth, then have a plan for what you're going to let them know, say like, okay, when you start to say like, Mom, you're so stupid, you never know how to help me with this, or, whatever, I'm going to walk away, right? Until you're able to, engage with me in a way that is respectful. So really setting up, getting their buy-in, asking questions, being curious, and setting up a plan that you're going to try. And I will say, and Yogi, I know you've had this experience working with parents, right? Those plans aren't always successful, right? Like, we make plans, we try them. Sometimes they're really helpful. Sometimes we have to come back to the drawing board, right? So you might try something out. It might not work so well. You come back and you talk about it and be like, how did that go? How did that work for you? It didn't, and maybe it worked for them, but it didn't work for you as the parent. So you can share that and say, we need to kind of adjust this in a way that's going to work for both of us.
And I think those we're going to misstep, we're going to fumble, we're going to drop the ball quite often as parents, but the love, knowing that we want the best for one another and being humble. I remember as a parent, the power struggles were always sometimes about me as the adult having the power and knowing, and I liked the drop the rope. And also saying, you know what? I don't know. I don't have the answer and I need your input. And I think as they grow, they just could have so much more shared power and responsibility also to be able to say, hey, this homework deal is not just my parents who want the grades that are, exceptional, but I too need to have those grades.
And sometimes we have to let our kids struggle, have them feel like it matters to them to get those grades, right? So if a parent has a certain expectation for their child and they're consistently kind of placing that expectation and doing whatever they can to make sure that child achieves that expectation, it actually can end up kind of backfiring on that child learning the skills of struggling, making mistakes, messing up, figuring it out for themselves, and, age appropriately, right? It depends on the age and what's happening, to be able to build the skills that they need to actually be super successful, in whatever that looks like. And so just keeping in mind, like, what our long-term goal is, and then what's going to actually help our child reach that is important.
Absolutely outstanding, step-by-step at least a few questions that can get parents started and curious again.
Yes.
One thing that comes to mind is that self-encouragement, because as parents, we become so anxious at certain time of the night because we know what's coming next, that homework or the bedtime or dinner struggles. And each area could be easily handled from this conversation. It seems like by finding the time, having a space where everyone's they're not overly anxious or feeling other emotions, but just a relaxed time where we can say, hey, let's talk about this at a certain time. Might be one of the examples of how we can get this conversation started. Wow, this is a very big topic because my children are now 30 and 28. And in our homes, they were sometimes some fiery conversations and responsibility as adults. It's like, I have to have all the answers. And this is really, again, encouraging to know that this is something that we can do with our children by including them. So talking about teenagers, experience mood swings and emotional challenges. So what can we do as parents to understand our teens' emotions? Only because often what they say is, leave me alone. I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. Or they want to close the door and stay in their room. So how can we rekindle with our lovely ones that have now become teenagers?
Well, the one thing that I think I always start with, obviously, my kids are not teenagers yet, so I speak from my professional experience, but I'm sure I will be experiencing the same thing because it is developmentally appropriate, right? Our kids are, as they become preteens and teenagers, they're starting to shift their attention away from family being kind of at the center to those friendships and those social relationships. And they're going through so much development at that time. Often there's puberty happening and then continuing on. And then there's thinking about transitioning, if they're later on in high school, transitioning to college, or a job or whatever they're going to do after high school. And so there's just so much happening in their emotional lives and socially, right? They're now with social media, right? There's just so much that they're trying to experience and navigate. And it is normal for them to push away a little bit. They're trying to figure out who they are, unrelated to you as the parent, right? So for so long, they're like seeing themselves as this joint force with the parents. And now they're trying to separate a little bit. And sometimes that separation, they need to feel like I'm pushing you away so I can feel who I am without you. And that can be really painful for both people, right? For both. One, I just think normalizing that for parents of like this, a certain level of this is typical and normal. It can get to the extreme, then we want to dig into that. But having parents know, like, keep trying, right? Finding creative ways to let your kids know that you're there, right? Capitalizing on the moments when, they are accessible for that kind of connection and conversation, and also respecting sometimes that they're not, right? And that their privacy is important. And you trust them and you're there for them, but continuing to kind of extend that olive branch, right? Continuing to offer those opportunities, knocking on the door, bringing them their favorite snack and just chatting for a few minutes and then giving them some space, inviting them to go do something with you that they know they'd really like, and just being, right? Just being without forcing conversation. I think those are some initial things that come to mind. I also think we also have to be aware of how we respond during challenging moments with our kids, right? So we want them to come to us with the big stuff, right? Like when they've made a giant mistake and they're really worried about it. And so stepping back and thinking about like, okay, how do I respond when maybe they come to me with some smaller things? Are they, am I responding in a way that gives them, some comfort and knows that, maybe I'm not going to be so happy with the choice that they've made, but I'm not totally shutting them down, and I'm continuing the conversation. I'm there to support them because, we want to leave that door open for them to see us as someone they could come to and ask questions of and get support even when they've made giant mistakes, right? And have us help guide them through that. And so just being thoughtful about like, how have we been responding? And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't do that well, right? Like I make a big deal every time they make a mistake. That's okay. You can actually own that with your kids. You can go to them at some point and be like, you know what? I have realized that this is really hard for me, right? Maybe you share with them that like, when you were a kid, you always got kind of major trouble when you made a mistake, and you are continuing that on as a parent, and you realize that that's an area you really want to work on, and you're really sorry that that's been something that you've struggled with and something you're going to work on. You're not going to do it perfectly, but you're going to work on it. And so I also, to that point that we were talking about before about like taking the shame out of some of these things, like we all are bringing our own stuff to the table. We're all not going to do this perfectly. And there's always ways to course correct and repair and keep moving forward in different ways, very imperfectly, but continue to move forward. And one thing I tell myself is like, I want my kids to see that model too, right? That they don't have to be perfect, that when they make mistakes, they can work on them and they can fix them. And if I never make mistakes and I never, struggle with something, then, they never get to see that modeled, right? Of like what that looks like, and what seeing an adult working on something and repairing it and taking accountability. And so that's just something that I keep in mind for myself. And I try to share with parents that I'm working with as well.
I think that vulnerability piece that you're speaking about in various culture, mine included, we have this thing about being an adult and sharing emotions and, who has the last say. And there were times just shifting and raising children. Sometimes it's just so humbling and it's just so beautiful and rewarding, where I'm just like, you know what? That was this craziest thing I could have said to you. I love you. And I don't know why that popped out of my mouth. And I'm working on it. And vice versa. The children are constantly asking, when you were young, what did you do? And those experiences really allowed to say, wow, you had the same thing, but, that happened in terms of friendships or being invited to a party or not. I think that just creates a little bit of that relationship. And we too, no matter which culture we come from, connection is universal. We can literally go to our child and just share how much we care about them. In some cultures, we don't talk about love and emotions. However, we could still put our arms around our child and say, your education is very important to me because I have a desire for you to be successful. But whatever success might mean, it's joy. I really want you to be happy. Really goes a long way. And then everything else works out. So this is a amazing, outstanding conversation about small steps we can take, because often when I speak to the leaders and caregivers, we're giving them tools and we haven't yet talked about it's not all or nothing. It could be just a small shift. Julianne, with your help, we were able to achieve that today. Do you have any last minute encouragements for our parents who are perhaps anxious of how they are being as a parent?
I think what you just said, Yogi, of like picking one tiny place that you want to start working on. Because sometimes when you listen to a podcast, right, or I know this happens to me, I read a parenting book or I listen to a podcast and it's something that I'm really struggling with, a topic that I'm struggling with, I can feel really overwhelmed, right? Like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this all wrong. I need to change everything. Like I've got to figure all of this out. And just taking a step back, right? Because we know we're going to be more successful. It's actually going to be healthier for us and our kids to not make huge shifts at a time, but just finding like one small place, like what's one tiny shift you can make and work on. And that's okay. That like, we know there's something called systems theory, right? And we know that if we make one tiny shift in a system, it impacts the entire system. And that's really what space is all about, right? That the parent making a shift in the system can actually make an impact on the entire system, including the child and the adolescent in the family. And so just a tiny spot. And even if the tiny spot is doing something to take care of yourself in some of those moments, like taking a walk around the block because you're struggling with how you might engage with your child, that's a great place to start. Being compassionate with yourself, and those small steps are where you can focus your energy instead of feeling like you need to change it all.
So as parents or school leaders or teachers, we often, are given lots of information. We take this course or we learn a little bit and we try to implement that in our home and schools. And we're given so much information and we try to take it all in. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work and it makes us discouraged or sometimes we give up. So tell us about working, like having something that works.
So I often, when I hear that language, I will kind of stop and reframe and talk about what does working mean? Like whoever is saying this didn't work. Okay, let's stop. What would working look like? Because often what the adult is saying, or even a kid when they're using that language, means like it didn't get all fixed, right? The behavior's still there. There's still this going on. And often like maybe there have been small shifts that have happened, but it doesn't feel so big enough for someone to say this has worked. And so it's important to track, if you're trying something new, track how it's going. Like as parents, I say like keep a little notepad where you can just jot down like what's happened each day. Just like tiny little notes, something that will on your phone, on a little piece of paper, whatever is going to make it easy for you. Because if you have a kid who's been really struggling and they have 3 days where, the behavior has subsided, right? And you're really like, whatever you're doing, you feel like it's really encouraging and it's helping. But then they have like really challenging day. It's going to bring up all of those feelings you were having before. And it's going to be hard for you to see the progress that is being made. Being able to kind of track that and be aware of what's actually happening, right? And giving it time and reframing, what does working mean and what does that look like is important.
Kind of breaking things down, right? Just kind of having trust that things are going to work out and it's not all or nothing.
Yeah. Sounds
more like, and you hit the nail on the head. I too often seem to look at what's not working versus what is working. So kind of that shift of mindset is something we could all try. So today, I'm going to start writing down what my hopes and goals were and the small dent that I make in that impact. Because I do need like the big impact. And if it's not a big impact, right?
Yes.
And our children are sensing some of this with the social media. How many likes and how many people are, and noticing them. So this is all a definite awareness, and more we know about ourselves, better we can support our anxiety and moving from anxiety to joy. And what I learned today with you, Julianne, another tool was anxiety is actually a good thing. Some of it.
Some of it. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Julianne. And listeners, if you like this conversation, please press the follow button and join us. I'm Yogi Patel, Transformation Through Empowerment. Thank you for listening to Now What? I'd love to know the questions that you might have in the future that you'd like to know more about, and we will get a speaker that can share about those questions. Thank you for being here. See you next time. If you like the content of this video, please don't forget to follow. And also, if you want more information, visit the website, yogipateltte.com.